Well, good morning. It's 10 o'clock. Welcome to the TAC meeting. So we do have a quorum, so we will go ahead and get started. So the first item is the approval of the TAC agenda for today. Somebody like to approve today's agenda?
Motion to approve. Second.
We have a motion and a second to approve today's agenda. All in favor say yay. All opposed? All right, we'll move on. All right, next we have the approval of the TAC meeting minutes from October 23rd, 2023. Make a motion, we'll go and approve the October meeting minutes.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye. All opposed? All right, thank you. All right, next, director's report, Chad.
Thank you, Mayor. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Despite Thanksgiving holidays, thank you for making the quorum. Appreciate that. We have a few items to report to you. The first item is call for projects. Long-range transportation plan, also called as MTP, Metropolitan Transportation Plan, and then TIP, the 4-year committed transportation projects list, transportation improvement program. Those two will have meetings in the months of February, March, April by project selection committee to determine what are the high priority for the region, both committed as well as long-range transportation plan. So to make that happen, staff is coordinating with member jurisdictions for call for projects from September till January 2024. So there's just an update for you that's happening. And then we're receiving projects. And then we also had a meeting for jurisdictions to help, application form and the processes and all. Staff is presenting how the process is set up and everything. So, for both MTP and TIP, they both have due dates in 2025. The MTP has June 2025, and the TIP is due in August 2024. So that's one of the reasons why the effort of call for projects in one quarter will help determine what are our regional priorities and projects. So the application packet and cost estimation model and everything is recorded. Meeting of number 8 is all available, and staff is happy to provide that information to any of you that is needed. So that's all the status on that, just to keep you in the loop on the schedule and what's happening with call for projects. If any questions, happy to clarify. Otherwise, we have a couple more items. We have a schedule developed by Marky Jonas, our WAMPO administrative assistant. She will present the schedule for the next year.
Hi, I'm Marky Jonas, administrative assistant. We have developed our 2024 schedules. All of the schedules follow the established meeting frequency, with the exception of the TAC meeting on May 20th, which has been scheduled a week earlier due to Memorial Day. The TPB and TAC meeting schedules will be presented to TPB on December 12th for approval. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Marky. This schedule will be approved by TPB, and then TAC is very similar every 4th Monday, 10 a.m., except for the Memorial Day in 2024, like Marky said. Next, we have MTP 2050 update. As you all know, there are several components that long-range transportation plan has, like safety plan is one component, transit, travel demand model, many components. So overall, what's the status of MTP? Dan is going to present briefly.
Thank you. So first of all, I wanted to share with you that the Plan Advisory Committee will meet on November 28th, which is tomorrow at 1:15 p.m. An update on the public engagement round 2. It begins on December 1st and it will last until February 29th. And then some of our confirmed events include the Holidays Pop-Up Market, May's Hoovel Vendor Market, and then the Lord's Diner, as well as some others that are starting to come in. And then an update on our scenario planning. So we have come up with our 3 scenarios. They are to maintain the current system, core resurgence, and then growth on the edge. The Plan Advisory Committee will select the preferred scenario after input has been gathered in the spring of 2024, and we'll have another update for you then. Questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Final brief report to you is the TIP Amendment 6 call for projects, and Nick here to briefly report to you. Nick.
Thank you, Chad. We have our next quarterly round of TIP amendments coming up with the call for changes running from the 4th to the 15th of December. However, if you want to get project information into us earlier than that, that would be more than welcome. As before, we will distribute a blank form for filling in new projects that you want added to the TIP. And if you want a project changed in the TIP, you can tell us what project that is, and then we can send you an Excel template filled in with the current information that you can then modify and send back to us. Just letting you know that that's coming up. And the public comment period will be from December 29th to January 12th. The TAC will make its formal recommendation in January. The TPB will make a formal vote on the amendment in February. And then it will get into the KDOT STIP on March 7th, after which any projects with federal funds may obligate if there were changes to any of that through the amendment. Any questions?
Thanks, Nick. Seeing no questions. Not listed on the agenda, but Mr. Chair, with your permission, I'd like to update on urban area boundary.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We had urban area boundary discussions in the past 3 or 4 months at the TAC meeting as well as at the TPB. And there were some confusion when the coordination between staff and the partner agencies like KDOT and FHW, but there was some confusion on rationale, how much to include on the urban area boundary and all. So based on those conversations and collaboration with partner agencies, we are revisiting and revising that urban area boundary. That will be, staff will be coordinating with federal partners and state DOT partners, and then present to you in the TAC meeting in January. And then for TPB approval in February again. So just wanted to give you a status update on that. This was based on the advice from our TPB members as well to look into the rationale, and then due to short timeline, the rationale and, collaborating more thoroughly. Also, this does not happen often. Urban area boundary happens once in a decade or once in 2 decades. So that's how some of the confusion we need to resolve and fix it. So just want to give you an update on that. That's all, Mr. Chair, with that, back to you.
All right, thank you. And it was approved at TPB, so you just don't go through the review and the updates and things like that. So, all right, great, thanks. All right, next we have item 3, public comments. This is open forum for the public to provide comments about specific items on this month's agenda or any other items. Are there any public comments? All right, seeing none, we'll move on to the action item. So we do have an action item today. It's the Comprehensive Safety Action Plan. We have Aaron, Slade, and Danny.
Yes. Thank you very much for having me. My name is Erin Grushon. I am a transportation planner with Burgess & Nyepel. And Burgess & Nyepel and Slade with Trans Systems have been working very close with WAMPO to develop this comprehensive safety action plan. And we wanted to take some time today to provide a formal presentation of what it is that we have developed, including what some of the recommendations are in the plan and what the next steps would be. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with the next slide, please. So just to provide a little bit of background on what it is that we're doing, the comprehensive safety action plans, they're also called CSAPs, are aimed at reducing and eliminating serious injury and fatal crashes. So it's a data-driven planning process that helps prioritize funding for safety improvements across the planning area. In this case, the WAMPO planning area. So an adopted CSAP will also make this region eligible to apply for a Safe Streets and Roads for All implementation grant. And those grants can provide funding to address major road infrastructure safety issues. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the components of the CSAP document and complementary tools are. So this is going to include background information about the planning process, including how public and stakeholders were engaged, as well as a review of transportation safety data and trends. That discussion will be led by Slade, who did the analysis, and then also a discussion of implementation and next steps. So first, just the overall context for how we kind of set up this planning process. The WAMPO CSAP is structured around the safe system approach. So the United States Department of Transportation safe system approach is a framework that helps agencies be more intentional about addressing safe roads, safe road users, safe speeds, post-crash care, and safe vehicles in their plans and ultimately in their programs. It's based on the concept that fatal and serious injury crash outcomes are preventable, and that the responsibility for traffic safety lies with multiple stakeholders, with roadway designers, car manufacturers, law enforcement, and policymakers, as well as drivers themselves. The safe system approach has 5 key elements: safe roads, safe road users, safe speeds, safe vehicles, and post-crash care. Layering these together creates redundancy so that if one of the components fails, the others are still in place to prevent severe outcomes. And one of the things I wanted to note when we get into the specific elements of the CSAP document is that we really have in our recommendations focused on the safe roads and safe road users piece. And that's not because they're any more important than the other 3 pieces, but the MPOs like WAMPO really do have limited ability to influence safe vehicles, which is, more on the manufacturing side, or post-crash care. So this plan really focuses on safe roads, safe speeds, and safe road users. And it does, we'll get into later talking about a set of implementation strategies that are included to address these elements. All right. So the next slide. Early on in the process, we worked with WAMPO and stakeholders to develop the vision, goals, and targets for the plan. The vision and goals rooted in the Vision Zero and the Safe System Approach principles played a pivotal role in guiding the plan development process, emphasizing a commitment to safety at every step. So our vision statement that you see here on the slide says that the WAMPO region envisions a path toward 0 road deaths through innovative infrastructure, comprehensive education, community-wide collaboration, underpinned by the principles of the safe system approach. So complementing that vision, we have specific goals of reducing conflicts at intersections, creating safer roads for all users, and employing a variety of tactics to reduce vehicle speeds. So for the next slide, kind of going back to the process for how we developed this, we also started out by doing a review of what has already been done in this transportation safety planning space in the region and in the state, because we wanted to complement and build on previous efforts. So we I've listed the documents here that we have reviewed and that we have tried to make sure that what we developed in the WAMPO CSAP is consistent with these other documents like the Kansas Strategic Highway Safety Plan, the Kansas Active Transportation Plan, Butler County Local Road Safety Plans, and then other WAMPO planning projects from the past, including the Regional Health and Transportation Report, which we actually updated as well as part of this process. So we updated that 2021 document with new data. And then the WAMPO's Vision Zero and MTP plans, and KDOT's Long Range Transportation Plan, and the Wichita Places for People Walkable Development book. So all of these were reviewed to kind of highlight, what relevant findings and data and information and goals we needed to consider in developing the CSAP. So you can go on to the next slide. And you can go ahead and click again. Sorry about that. So now I wanted to talk a little bit more about how we involved stakeholders and the public throughout this process. So I know there have been some previous updates to the WAMPO committees, including the Technical Advisory Committee in the past, but there was what was called the Transportation Safety Technical Advisors, so a special committee sort of formed to focus on this plan development, and that TSTA met 3 times during the planning process to provide input, guidance, feedback. In addition to meeting with the TSTA and providing updates to the other WAMPO committees, we did do an online public survey, which I'll tell you a little bit more about the kind of input we got through that here in a minute. And we held an in-person open house, a public open house. So that was hosted by Walk Bike Wichita. And so I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on what we did with each of these 3 elements. But in addition to the TSTA, the public survey, and the open house, WAMPO also provided project updates through their website, developed a promotional video early on about what we were doing with the safety campaign, and also social media to let people know about the plan and how they could get involved and provide input. So on the next slide, we list the members of the TSTA that I mentioned earlier. This was a group of transportation safety professionals in the region that was formed to offer guidance and recommendations to the CSAP plan development. They met 3 times in 2023 and uncovered critical areas of emphasis for crash prevention and study, and really helped to highlight what the emphasis areas that will go into that Slade will talk about more in his part of the presentation. The TSTA helped select those emphasis areas, and we also talked with them about potential safety countermeasures. So the next slide, this just provides a little bit more information about what happened in each of those meetings. So we started out by evaluating the current state of different safety practice benchmarks of agencies in the region. So this was like the first TSTA meeting was kind of like a workshop where we presented information about what are all of these different things that agencies could be doing to address safety, and then kind of evaluating with this group where things currently stand in the region. And that would help us kind of know where we are already doing well and we could build on that momentum, and then also room for improvement. So in the second meeting, we, as I mentioned, worked with the group to prioritize the top 3 emphasis areas for the CSAP. So those are intersection, speed, and vulnerable road users. And then we also started reviewing potential safety countermeasures. And the third meeting included a walk audit of several high crash intersections that had been identified through the analysis that Slade did. And then we also further discussed some countermeasures for the region. So, and just to provide you a little bit more information about the public survey that I mentioned a minute ago, this was done online. We did receive 209 responses between January and March of 2023, so the beginning of this year. The purpose of this was to understand the current safety attitudes and concerns of residents. It included questions about behaviors of different road users, vulnerable road user protection, enforcement, equity, and the top investment priorities. So we shared information about how to take this survey through the WAMPO webpage, through social media, and also through community-based organizations. And on this slide, you can see the results of one of the questions where survey respondents indicated that their top investment priorities are intersection improvements and improvements to bike facilities and improvements to pedestrian or ADA facilities. And then on the next slide, you can see that the survey also included an interactive map that allowed participants to place points at the locations of their greatest safety concerns in the region. So each of these points represents a single comment that was made by a member of the public. The colors represent different types of safety concerns. So, for example, yellow, that bright yellowish orange color is a speed concern. That purplish pink color is driving under the influence concern. The deep green, it's distracted driving. And the unsafe intersections are that like light turquoise-ish, greenish blue color. But we were able to take this information and look at it along with the actual crash data analysis that Slade conducted. So on the next slide, the public open house that I mentioned, I was going to provide a little bit more detail on that as well. So this was co-hosted through the Safety and Health Committee, which has since been renamed ICT Safe, held a public open house. And then we had 27 people attend, and this included representatives from Bike Walk Wichita, the Health and Wellness Coalition, Kansas Health Foundation, the cities of Derby and Andover, and Wichita residents. So a part of this meeting was really just informative, where we were providing information about the planning process and what we were doing, but we also wanted to get feedback from the public about some of the different potential countermeasures that could be considered related to safe road users and safe roads. So we had a dot exercise. There was a big poster also for safe roads, but I'm just showing the safe road users ones here, where we talked through some of the different countermeasures related to safe road users to get feedback from people on which ones they thought might be most beneficial in the region. And so this is just one element of the data collection that we took into consideration, along with the TSTA input, along with all of the conversations from various committees representing the WAMPO region. This was another data point that we could take into consideration when developing our recommendations. So go to the next slide. We're stuck.
Me. Will that work?
All right, there we go. I think this is the point where I'm going to hand it over to Slade and let him talk through the existing conditions and crash analysis.
So I think a lot of you have seen this presentation, or at least parts of it before. I gave an early version of this the spring of last year, I think. So I'll try to be brief, but if you have any questions, don't hesitate to stop me or throw something at me or something like that. So I can stop and further elaborate. We had about a little over 100,000 crashes we ended up looking at. We took a 10-year horizon on the data. And the reason for that was kind of twofold. One was the last few years with COVID obviously changed some patterns and crashes and things that were happening. While we didn't want to necessarily exclude any of that data, I don't know that that's also what you want to build your program around. So through a lot of the discussions with the TSTA and with WAMPO staff and many of you, we did wind up looking at that 10-year horizon for that reason. The other thing that happened in that time frame was around 2019. Well, it was in 2019. If you look at serious injury and injury, the differences between those, KDOT had shifted their definition of serious injury at the request of the FHWA. So if you start seeing some of those trends in the latter part of the The graphs on this screen, they do kind of change around 2019 between the injuries and the serious injuries. And that is a reason why as well. So to kind of avoid a lot of trying to massage that data too much, we decided instead to take a longer view of some of the crash trends in the area. Looking at it from kind of where they're happening versus state system versus non-state system, most of these are happening off state system. And as far as the breakdown, I believe it may not be exactly 1-for-1, but it's pretty close. It's almost a population map as far as where they're occurring as well. So the population of the different cities, if you have a higher population, you're going to have more crashes, essentially, kind of what this maps or what the data is telling us on that one. Breaking down the types of crashes, all this data, I should preface this to earlier in the slides, that all this data comes from the crash database, which comes from the forms that the officers fill out every time there is a crash on the roadway. They fill out a form and submit it into KDOT. So all this data is coming from a number of different jurisdictions submitting those reports. And we can get into that a little bit more as I start going down the road, but just keep that in the back of your mind as we go through this. So the major crash type was other motor vehicles, and there's a chart that'll break that down further in the next slide. After that, it was fixed objects and, basically a parked motor vehicle. And then if you start looking at there, that FSI, and that's fatal severity index, it's the percentage of the fatal serious crashes as a percent of the total. When you start looking at that, though, it's kind of interesting. Overturned pedestrian and bicycle essentially take a big chunk of that, as well as railway. So if you start looking at that, while there isn't as many total crashes, they tend to be more severe when they have a crash, if that makes any sense. Looking at the collision with other vehicles, that got broken down a little bit further. Again, those angle side impacts are what you're really starting to try to focus in on. Head-ons are the next one kind of over there on the FSI side that are pretty high as well. So again, those are crash types that you kind of want to target when you start thinking about how bad things are happening or how bad they are on a severity scale. Another way to look at those is by equating those to equivalent property damage only. Through KDOT, we were able to obtain the actual costs of each, or the average costs of each type of crash. So a fatality is obviously way more expensive and costly than a property damage only. So all this is doing is equating those into, if you had the equivalent number of property damage only crashes, this is how it would shake out. So you see kind of train takes over by the equivalency on that, because they're so high on the number of fatalities that are happening. This chart, again, there's a lot of pink on this, but essentially what we did here was we tried to come up with a way to identify where the crashes are happening within each jurisdiction, because WAMPO is made up of a number of different jurisdictions. The pink ones are the ones that are overrepresented, so to speak, in that type of crash. So for instance, take the first line of Wichita. Other motor vehicle crashes happen more in Wichita than they do in Sedgwick County. So just looking at that chart, that's all that's trying to tell you is the ones over the region average are the highlighted ones, the ones under are the unhighlighted ones. So if you think about an average spread, the ones at the higher end are the ones highlighted, ones at the lower end are not. So that's kind of interesting when you start looking at some of the, for instance, different types like fixed object crashes there, are happening more in either rural county or some of the smaller cities that may have some rural roads that the fixed objects may be a little bit closer on, or maybe in the clear zone, things like that. Equity analysis, we also did the two different EJ areas that WAMPO has. I think one is an income-based one, and the other is a underserved population of some sort. I don't recall the second one, but we combined the two areas. You can kind of see that in the lighter beige. I'll highlight here. this kind of lighter beige area is I think the EJ area that was looked at. And within that, we kind of took a look at the same crash trends where they were happening. A lot of that, again, is occurring inside the ring roads on that chart. So collision with other vehicles, this is, again, zoomed back out, looking at the whole thing again, becomes pretty blobby, but you can start seeing a little bit of a pattern with some of that, in that they focus on a lot of the intersections. Pedestrian and bicycle crashes, Broadway kind of starts becoming apparent. That's what the red heat zone in the downtown area are. But a lot of that does concentrate in the downtown area for a lot of the bicycle and ped crashes that are occurring, although there are some kind of spread out throughout the whole region. So contributing circumstances, one of the purposes, and Chad was very clear early on that this was something that we wanted to kind of take a look at, is why are these crashes happening in the region, and what is the really what's behind some of this stuff. And in looking at the chart on the table here, a lot of these you can argue about which ones to include as inattentive driving. For instance, if somebody's following too closely, is that inattentive or is that an aggressive driving move? But somewhere in the neighborhood around 30% of the crashes are happening because of some form of inattention in general. The interesting thing about contributing circumstances too, I should point out, is you can have more than one associated with them. And these are, again, from the officers in the field. So for instance, you have this one down here where it was a right-of-way violation and they went ahead and attributed it to inattention. So you can see with some of this, and you think through the number of officers, even for WPD, let alone all the other jurisdictions, the ability to fill these forms out consistently is something that becomes very important throughout some of this as well. So moving forward, if that's something that's able to be stressed a little bit within the police departments, that's something that could help you out a lot. It was kind of pointed out that even in the non-intersection version, which is why this is blue here, ran red light is a predominant piece of that. So you can tell if you're in a non-intersection and you run a red light. I don't know that that's happening at pedestrian crossings and things like that. That's why they did that, but there's a pretty high number of those happening. So I'd say there's a lot of coding issues going on with some of this data. Getting into emphasis area, Aaron alluded to this. We spent a whole one of the TSTA meetings talking through this data again, as well as some contributing circumstances, and then started focusing in really on these emphasis areas. So if you're looking at all crashes, the biggest predominant crash, as I kind of alluded to earlier, on the maps is intersection related crashes. Right next to that's, distracted driving, and then you kind of start going down the list. And you can kind of see how that kind of goes through. And again, this is all crashes. And then we looked at also fatal and serious injury crashes to kind of see how that changed. And so it did change things a little bit. You see roadway departure comes up, distracted kind of drops. Some of these things start kind of shaking out. Vulnerable road users, we combined the pedestrian and bicycle. Some people combine the motorcycle into that as well. We left the motorcycle a little bit separate there, but you can kind of see the blue line, the blue part of the bar graph is the fatality. So you can look at that as well if you want to just look at fatalities. But either way, intersection related crashes are the number one kind of area to start focusing in on. From that meeting, that was also what was picked up on was the intersection related crashes were the area to focus on, was what was selected as the main focal point. This chart was also presented, so you can have overlapping emphasis areas as well. So for instance, it could have been an intersection related crash that was drunk driving related, right? They're not mutually exclusive. So if you want to look at how they overlap, we kind of put this little chart together to look at, say, hey, of the speed related crashes, 50% happened at an intersection. So if you start looking at this chart, you can kind of start seeing that. From that, when we looked at those, vulnerable road users and speed were also additional emphasis areas that were selected because of the overlap within those intersection crashes. And the reasons kind of associated that. TSTA really pushed both of those to be kind of included kind of as a subset almost to those intersection crashes because of the interrelationship everybody felt was going on. So from that, we created we did a kind of a clustering analysis of the crashes. And so you'll see here, these are basically the top speed-related crashes. And again, it's somewhat of a volume map, but not really. A lot of them kind of hover around that 54 Kellogg area, just off of it one way or the other. And then there were some outliers. 21st and Mays came up, some of the K15, some things like that started shaking out. Rock and K96 were all areas that kind of started dropping in there on the speed related side. We split the intersections into unsignalized and signalized, mainly because we felt like that would be a good way to look at different countermeasures possibly within the two groups. A lot of them overlap, but when you start getting into the countermeasures, obviously changing signal timings or something like that doesn't work on, say, a four-way stop. So we did separate those out. Again, not too dissimilar from speed, a little bit more focus on the 54 area, I would say. Right in the downtown, kind of either adjacent on some of those unsignalized streets. Signalized, same sort of thing. There is, you know, a few more of these outliers that start kind of coming in, but again, the main focus points pretty similar as to where a lot of these crashes are happening. And then the VRUs. So this was the third emphasis area that was selected. Broadway. And I might try to move Aaron, and I'm not going to actually do that because I think I'm going to mess something up pretty quick. But up in the top right, if you looked at Broadway in this area right here, that kind of shakes out. And I think this is Seneca, if I'm not mistaken. I'd have to double check that one, but you can kind of see kind of those same patterns of a few things. I think the south one was Pawnee. That kind of goes east-west right in there. So again, interesting stuff, but it seems like a few of these start kind of coming up again and again and again between them. Aaron, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. So one of the kind of, I guess, the real meat of the plan itself is this implementation plan, which I know we had shared this when it was in the draft development stage, as we, kind of wanted to get feedback on it before putting out the full CSAP document. But the implementation plan identifies strategies to reduce severe crashes for the selected emphasis areas that Slade just reviewed. So the vulnerable road users, intersection-related crashes, and speed-related crashes. The strategies included in the implementation plan are organized by the safe systems approach component that they each address. So going back to earlier in the presentation when I talked about how, of the 5 safe systems components, we really focus on safe roads and safe road users, because those are the two that WAMPO and, MPOs like WAMPO have the most influence over, as opposed to, vehicle safety. So on the next slide, I'll show you an example of what the implementation plan itself looks like. And these are just 3 of the strategies. There are 18 strategies total that are listed in the plan. Each strategy includes information about the desired outcome, responsible party or parties to carry out the strategy, anticipated time frame, and it also shows you which of the emphasis areas are addressed by the strategy. So of these three address all three emphasis areas. That's not the case for every single strategy included in the list, but they all at a minimum address one of the emphasis areas. One thing that I kind of wanted to note is that there are a couple strategies that were included under the Safe Roads component that aren't shown here, but I'll just read them out to you. So developing a countermeasure toolbox, and then developing safe streets visualizations and a Vision Zero toolkit for the region. Those two are actually currently underway. And we, BNN has been working with WAMPO and Transsystems to develop those two items. So those will be completed as part of the effort that we're doing to develop the CSAP itself. The countermeasure toolbox is just going to go into more detail about what different types of infrastructure and in some cases non-infrastructure treatments would be most effective depending on the different safety concerns that you are trying to address. So that will be out and ready later this year. So on the next slide. So as far as next steps, we're wrapping up the CSAP. We are, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we are really trying to set you up to be able to go after that Safe Streets for All implementation grant funding. So, and having an adopted CSAP is one of the requirements that meets all of the federal criteria for the CSAP, which this one it does. So assuming that we can get this plan adopted, we would work with WAMPO to develop the grant application for, the selected implementation grant. And that, so there's a few things that I wanted to emphasize as far as that goes. The implementation Safe Streets for All is highly competitive. And so we would want to work to show that demonstrated need for safety interventions revealed by the data that Slade was just sharing. So where he was showing and highlighting some of those corridors that were coming up over and over as areas of safety concern, we could work with the WAMPO communities to identify what strategies would make the most sense to go after implementation funding there. And those would need to be consistent with at least one of the 18 implementation plan strategies that I discussed. But those implementation strategies, we have intentionally left them somewhat broad so that there's flexibility in developing that implementation grant application where we can look at the high crash locations identified by the safety analysis and match those up with the strategies that make the most sense to develop that competitive application process. So as far as that goes, I believe that is our full presentation. Are there any questions?
I had one question. Going back to the crash types by jurisdiction, when you have Sedgwick County, does that include all of those other cities that are listed here that are in Sedgwick County?
No, that was separate. So.
Do have one comment, like on whenever there's any acronyms, if they can be spelled out, such as on page 47, PDO is in green for property damage only. I didn't see where that was spelled out anywhere, so I didn't look anywhere else on here. I just happened to notice that one.
Okay. You did talk about at one point the coding, kind of how each department kind of codes the crash, and the data on that. Should that be one of the strategies to kind of have training across the entire region, making sure that each department knows kind of, how to code things so we have more data on that?
I think KDOT's got a program in place right now that they have been working on that too. It is kind of a known thing. I know WPD switched systems, I think in 2019 as well, and some of that data didn't exactly translate perfectly, and they've been going back and recoding that and resubmitting it as well. So again, those last few years, there's a little bit of a question mark with some of that data. And again, part of it is the anomalies with COVID and everything going on with that too. So it's hard to distinguish a lot of that, but there have been a few programs put in place, and it is something that KDOT is working to make sure that, there's also been turnover in a lot of the, police officers and all that. So there's been a ton of turnover in all those departments. So it is an ongoing issue that I think there is some additional training and stuff that the DOT is looking at putting out.
Because I know, like in Valley Center, we're still rolling out our Brazos, I think, system. So I don't know if that narrows down what the selection, is. So maybe it makes it easier. But the turnover, yes, I think all of our departments have experienced that, here recently. So thank you.
Quick comment, and thanks, Slade and Aaron. Great job in putting this together. And even the study was. The involvement of many of you were also in the TSTA, the committee. One of the questions I have is, how do we assist member jurisdictions to win the implementation grant in 2024? Like, for example, should we make an effort to identify the corridor and the countermeasures in making a robust application for the implementation grant? I'm trying to estimate the time and effort involved to make a successful grant application, because this meets the federal requirements to have a good CSAP, but beyond this, how much time and effort we need to make so that the SS4A grant, implementation grant in 2024.
I can take an initial stab at some of it, and then you can fill in wherever I speak. But I think as part of this, there were 3 or 4 different types of application, or the successful applications that we presented to, I want to say the TAC and the TPB, I think the last time around. There's a number of different ways you can approach this, but as a, whatever you need to do, I would say you need to be very cohesive in doing it, would probably count a little bit more. A lot of the agencies have not done that. So I don't know how 100% successful that's going to be, but at the same time, Louisville did a pretty good job of where they did a bunch of different spot improvements. Or if you want to look at it, focus on a corridor, say, or something, I think Columbus was one of the other examples that's out there. So I would say yes, identification of what you want to go after, and that will help. Like if it helps, you could look at some of those past applications to focus on. There is a significant amount of effort, I would say, that goes into those applications. And I'll let Aaron fill in anything I did not talk about, or if I spoke out of turn.
No, I mean, I completely agree. I think the most important thing to do first is going to be figuring out what forum you want to have that regional conversation, and deciding what specifically you want your project or collection of projects to be for the implementation grant funding. And as Slade mentioned, we've presented some information at previous meetings about what has been successful. And just like as a quick refresher, one single big project in one location has not really been funded in most of the cases for the implementation grant funding. There was the Louisville one that Slade mentioned, where they were looking at the spot improvements at different intersections all over the city. And then the Columbus corridor one, was like a longer stretch of roadway. So I think trying to figure out, based on the information that was included in this plan, what the priorities for the region are, which direction you might want to go, as far as is it going to be looking at a collection of intersections that are, and I'm just throwing out examples based on the analysis and what's in the plan. Like one direction you could go is like really honing in on intersections where vulnerable road user safety is a concern, and then build it from there. So I think that's back to what Slade was saying about it being cohesive. You need to be able to tell the story of even if there's multiple locations in the region that you're recommending as part of the infrastructure, or I'm sorry, of the implementation grant funding, you need to be able to tell the story of how they relate to each other and how they relate to the CSAP and the analysis and recommendations that came out of the CSAP.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Slade. I appreciate all the work you did.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions or comments?
Okay, then I will go ahead and present to you your action options. They are on the screen. WAMPO staff recommends that you approve the Comprehensive Safety Action Plan as presented.
Anybody like to make a motion?
Motion to approve. I'll second.
So we have a motion and a second to approve the Comprehensive Safety Action Plan as presented. Well, not approve, but to approve it to go forward to the Transportation Policy Board. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? All right, thank you. All right, next we have discussion updates. We have a bike ped count results. Dora?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So every year since 2012, WAMPO has done manual bicycle and pedestrian counts with the efforts of volunteers and our jurisdictional members. So this year, our top 5 locations were Douglas and Washington, the Arkansas River Path at the Keeper of the Plains, the Broadway and First intersection, and then Sedgwick County Park at 21st Street, and then Oak Park area. You can see some of the ADT, so the annual average daily traffic, and these are conducted through the National Bicycle and Pedestrian Documentation Project standards. And we have 5 counts, so 2 in the morning, 2 in the evening, and then 1 Saturday afternoon count for all the locations. There was 35 locations, but only 34 were counted due to not sufficient volunteers for Mulvane this year. Here's our count projections for all the locations, and you can find this on our interactive map online as well. And the interactive map also shows all the previous years going back to 2012. So the darker the number, the higher the count. And here are all the locations with the average daily split projections between bicycle riders, walking, and the vehicle. The ones that you see that don't have any, like, I think there's a pointer right now, but the main on Mulvane, you'll see that there's no data since we didn't collect any data there this year. And then if there's no vehicle ADT, is usually because it's at a park or screen line where we can't get any vehicle ADT, and we get that split. We can see the split between the different locations. So same here with at K96 path at Greenwich, we have no ADT because it's at a trail, so we have no vehicle daily ADT, daily traffic. Yeah, if you want the top 10, I can go over really quickly. So we have Douglas and Washington at first, and then Keeper of the Plains, Broadway and First, Sedgwick County Park at 21st, Oak Park, Redbud Path, in Andover, the Patricia Lane, and then Sedgwick County Park at 13th Street, and then Keachai Park in Keachai, and then Main and Grand in Hayesville, and 5th and Meridian and Valley Center. So it's really good to see all the other jurisdictions outside of Wichita getting in the top 10 this year. Any questions or comments? The whole report can be found on our website online under the Bicycle and Pedestrian Project tab.
Your question?
Yes, Ellen.
Yes, actually.
So Dora, I've got a lot of questions, but I'll maybe talk to you afterwards about some of the details and stuff, but just a couple of comments too. First of all, I'll point out that the numbers show a huge increase. It's hard to figure out, hard to compare apples and oranges, but it's something like more than 50% increase from 2022 in the counts. But it's also, I think it's really interesting that going to the AADT count or estimates, there are several locations in Wichita where 10 or even 20% of the AADT is bike and ped, like Douglas and Washington, Broadway and First, 15th and Broadway, 17th and Hillside. There's several of those that make up a very substantial portion of the AADT.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Yeah, we'll definitely have a chat after.
Hey, Dora, I have a question.
Yes.
When you take the counts year after year, are you making note of the weather at the time of those counts?
Yeah, we asked every year for the volunteers to write down the weather, and then we'll make a note in our projections table, and in our report as well. So this year and last year we had a shift in dates due to the weather. So we also adjust that in our report.
That's in the written report.
Yeah.
I know you're working on the automatic bike ped counts. You have any updates on that?
No updates yet. It should be going to KDOT today, hopefully. Yeah.
Staff is also coordinating with member jurisdictions on local match as well. I think 100,000 is set aside, right, Dora?
Yes.
So we are preparing RFP, and then RFP is ready to go. It was reviewed by KDOT as well. And then pretty soon we will post it for vendors to send applications of their products, and we'll form a selection committee from member jurisdictions. That is the next step, Mr. Chair. During all this process, we also want to be sure our member jurisdictions are well aware of what are all the resources. For example, one of the technologies of the counter has the electric, the electric poles, and those are the sources used for the cameras on the top. As one example, how that becomes important, because what is the source of is it the battery source or is it electrical power lines is the one example. Now, the other example is the technologies are utilizing images processing between pedestrian and bicyclist and scooter and vehicle turn moments. And also the technologies also have developed in such a way that only the data is extracted, not the images are stored anymore. For some technologies have that ability, so privacy is protected. So stuff like that, we are evaluating all those and wanting to share with our member jurisdictions so that in the selection process, we are aware of what is available and what are our resources and those types of things. So that is some of the work we are still, staff is still meeting with our jurisdictions, while we are also ready preparing for the RFP and sending it out. So these are some of the loose ends we are tightening right now once we are ready to go and stuff. That's the status on that.
Thank you, Chad. Thank you, Dora. Are there any other further questions or discussion? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, next we have B, the travel demand model update with Mike and Paul.
Good morning, thank you. My name is Mike Malone with JEO. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today. In a little while, you'll hear from Paul Ricotta with Caliper Corporation, who'll be presenting on part of the update of the travel demand model. So do I just click the mouse here to advance? I use the mouse either way. All right. Well, we last presented on this back in, I think in the spring, I want to say April or May, and gave a brief presentation then, and we were fairly early on in the project. But as you all know, the travel demand model is really one of the core tools that WAMPO uses to estimate travel demand and evaluate transportation improvement options. And you'll hear a little bit more about that as we go through our presentation this morning. In addition to the travel demand model itself, there's a lot of other uses for the model that we'll touch on. The MTP is a separate project that's going on. Our project will support that in terms of the application of the model, certainly coming up with the TIP and the Transportation Improvement Program for the various agencies, and then the congestion management process. So there's a number of other uses that the model comes into play for. In terms of our project, the travel demand model update is one of the key tasks, but there were a number of other things that we're doing as part of the project. We are going to be running the model in support of a couple of things, including the MTP process. I'll talk in a little bit more detail later about the congestion management process, the environmental justice analysis methodology that we're just starting on. And then I'll touch on some community engagement, which was actually a pretty significant part of this project. In terms of our project schedule, you can see that we're about 3/4 of the way or so through about a 20-month project schedule. We're slated to wrap up most of the modeling activities here in the next month or two, with the remainder of our time through April or April-ish timeframe being devoted primarily to, I would say, model application activities and running the model for various activities. So we're kind of, rounding the bend and nearing the end of the initial project schedule. Wanted to touch on stakeholder engagement. You heard about that in the last presentation as well. And I guess I need to kind of give Chad and the WAMPO staff credit. I think that, modeling is something that could sort of be done in a bubble or in a vacuum. It's sort of a complicated thing. And I think we've been pretty intentional at their direction in terms of including a lot of different stakeholders, whether it's been our working committees as part of the travel demand model update itself, or a congestion management committee that we formed, or the public that we've done some stakeholder surveys, as you heard in the safety presentation. We've also got there's a companion project going on where we've worked pretty extensively with the Center for Economic Development and Business Research at Wichita State for some of the socioeconomic data. So there's been quite a few different ways that we've engaged with stakeholders on various aspects of the project. This slide kind of just goes into a bit more detail on some of those things, but there is a project webpage. Certainly encourage you to visit that if you want to kind of dig in and learn more about the project. There's a fact sheet here that's shown. There's a fairly simple explanation of some of the key elements of the travel demand model update. Again, surveys, we participated in a couple of different surveys. One was done through the MTP process, where there was kind of a subset of questions that were more related to the congestion management process. And then we had a separate survey that was done that was more focused on the congestion management process itself. I'll touch on a TDM animation here on the next slide. And then I wanted to, this is not necessarily local stakeholder engagement, but I wanted to kind of give kudos to Chad, because at his direction, we actually presented on this project at the AMPO conference a couple of months ago. And I think that's great, just that you're bringing attention to the work that's being done here in the Wichita area with a lot of the peers around the country. So hats off to Chad for taking the initiative and doing that. We set out to try to do something as part of the stakeholder engagement. Hopefully this works, but we wanted to develop something. So we put together an animation that's about a minute long. What's that?
The Wichita Area Metropolitan Planning Organization, otherwise referred to as WAMPO, is updating its travel demand model, or TDM. A travel demand model is a software tool used by planners to provide a picture of existing and future travel in the region, and the demand it places on streets, sidewalks, bike paths, and public transportation networks. The model is also used to evaluate which future or proposed transportation projects will serve the needs of the region. The WAMPO TDM includes a 4-step process that helps forecast future transportation system needs, including who's traveling, where to, travel how, and by what route. Understanding what the model can do is important for understanding how it will be integrated into WAMPO's long-range metropolitan transportation plan. Proceed to the next video to learn more.
So there you go. We, like I said, we kind of attempted to take something that's fairly complicated and maybe not well understood by the broad public and tried to sort of boil it down to the basics, something that was fairly understandable. So that's online if you want to go listen to it again or share it with folks. I think we found success in doing that in terms of reaching out to the public and being able to explain something in a fairly short time.
The Wichita area.
And last, on stakeholder engagement, again, the project website, wampo.org, TDM, there's more information there if you'd like to learn more. As we got into the modeling process, one of the first things that we did was develop a GIS dashboard or a traffic count dashboard. And, you know, this is fairly simplistic kind of at its core level, but I think the really good thing about this is that we took count data from all of the various jurisdictions. So whether it's city, county, KDOT, KTA, all the different jurisdictions in the area, and we've assembled all this information in one, you know, easy accessible location so that counts from the last 4 to 5 year period were readily available for the model development and model calibration process. And this is something that can be kind of a living dashboard, living document moving forward. Moving on to the congestion management process, as you can see on this slide, the CMP is really it's a federally mandated program, but it's also something that's fairly loosely defined in terms of how it's applied to each individual organization, but it's intended to be a continual process where the agencies in the region can basically evaluate congestion management strategies, develop metrics, performance measures, objectives to evaluate and test those, and then continually evaluate and move on. And so as we went through this process, this slide shows kind of the key activities, and we spent some time early on talking with Chad and the rest of the WAMPO staff, and also kind of doing a best practices review to sort of zero in on what really was the right sizing of the congestion management process for the Wichita area. I've touched on some of the survey information, or I'll touch on that in a little bit more detail as we move forward. And then, of course, developing regional objectives and performance measures. We currently have a draft of the CMP that WAMPO staff are reviewing, so you'll hear more on that in the near future, I would assume, as that process moves forward. In terms of some of the stakeholder outreach, and this is just a couple of examples, but we reached out to a group of folks that were involved in the CMP, and we also had some broader questions that went out to, I would say, to the public at large. And you know, this one's fairly intuitive, but we asked them to give us some insight on reasons for traffic congestion. I think these are pretty logical. They align with, I think, things that you would expect to see: peak hour traffic volumes, crashes, limited capacity, distracted drivers, roadway access management. I think those all seem to align with, I think, what a lot of people think. But it was kind of a reality check for us to make sure that what we were thinking as transportation professionals also aligned with what the public was seeing or telling us. This is another example, another illustration of what were some of the areas of greatest concern from a traffic congestion perspective. And I think, again, as you scan this, you'll kind of see some areas that you're probably very familiar with, areas that you drive through, areas that you probably say, yeah, those are areas that we do experience congestion at. And again, I think there was pretty good alignment between what the model was telling us was happening throughout the region in terms of volume to capacity ratios or congested roadway segments, and what we were hearing from the public. A lot more detail is provided in the draft report, but this slide summarizes basically two key things. One is the regional objectives, and on the left side of the slide, you can see that we really focused in on 4 key areas, and that was improving the efficiency of the multimodal network, the reliability of the network, increasing mobility across the network, and that's not just single vehicle use, but really all modes of transportation, and then safety, because safety certainly has a big role in the congestion management process. And then on the right side are some of the performance measures that we've identified. Some of these are sort of prescribed federally by the congestion management process and the FHWA mandate, and some of these are more fine-tuned to what we felt based on our work with the Congestion Management Committee. What were some of the performance measures that were most applicable to the Wichita region? So these will be used as the congestion management process goes forward to evaluate and test improvement measures. The last item that I'm going to touch on before I turn it over to Paul is on the environmental justice analysis methodology. We're just sort of getting into this task. And again, we're spending some time talking with Chad and WAMPO staff in terms of what is the right formula for environmental justice in the Wichita region. And what we're really trying to do is focus in on the TDM application strategies that we can look at in terms of perhaps transit access for these sensitive populations, or maybe other accessibility concerns, whether it be healthcare or education or employment, or if there's a disproportionate impact on sensitive populations from a standpoint of traffic congestion or improvement projects that are being considered. So those are all part of the things that we'll be considering as we go through the rest of this process, and then we'll report back to you on that again later in the project. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul, who is remote and has been leading the effort to develop the travel demand model.
All right. Thanks, Mike. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Paul Ricotta. I work for the subconsultant firm here, Caliper Corporation, and we are the developers of the travel demand modeling application, but not only just that, but also the software that the application runs in, which is called Transcad. And WAMPO has been a user for many, many years of the Transcad software with different modeling applications built by different consultants. So we were selected, fortunately, to do this update project with JEO. And some of the key objectives here that we were trying to accomplish would be to, one, update the base year model, which was based on a 2017 base year, and bring that forward to 2022. So that would mean things like updating the demographics, the employment data, all the types of things that go into a travel demand model. So that would bring things forward, move things forward into a post-pandemic environment, and try to observe some of the changes that might have occurred in travel behavior during the pandemic. So some of the objectives here, we wanted to bring the model forward to another higher level in terms of state of the practice. So one of the key elements in the model is how we deal with the different socioeconomic characteristics, whether they're more in an aggregate level, like say at a zonal level, using averages across the zone, or whether we could introduce more sort of disaggregate type data, for example, like being able to model each and every household in the WAMPO area. So we incorporated a disaggregate methodology using what's called population synthesis. I'll talk a little bit about that. And what this allows us to do is to get a little bit better resolution, capture those travel behavior dynamics a little bit more accurately and a little bit more closely, and certainly moving the model into a kind of an area that is more commonplace nowadays than, say, it was in 2017. So bring things forward to match more the state of the practice. Some of these other things include migrating to more advanced techniques for trip distribution and mode choice. So things like introducing alternative methodologies to trip distribution rather than something simplistic, which was pretty much used in all previous model updates, called the gravity model for trip distribution. We introduced what's called destination choice. So this is a different type of approach that allows us to use different additional variables and get a little bit better resolution. So I mentioned already, capturing the post-pandemic travel behavior was a critical piece. One of the things that we did in this particular update is utilize what's called LBS data. You may know what this is. LBS stands for location-based services. This is data that is provided typically by cell phone operators. It's not particularly rich in terms of its resolution with respect to the trip making or the trip purposes that we use in the model, but it gives us an idea. When used with some of the other data that we have, it helps verify and things. So I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. And the other type of data is the connected vehicle data. So this is vehicle data that comes from satellite navigation systems that are embedded in different vehicles and other connected vehicle technology. And then it's just basically transmitted to a mothership and then processed and given to us in some raw form that we further process and try to use that to understand some of the travel making characteristics. So this can be good for verifying things like the through trip distribution of and for how much traffic, for example, is traveling through WAMPO, coming in from, say, the west and heading out to the east, or vice versa, north, south, whatever it might be. So this data can be very useful. It's not a panacea by any stretch of the imagination, but it's data that is that can be made useful within this environment of model estimation, and at least to verify some of the things that we believe to be true coming out of the model. One of the other things that we wanted to do with this particular model was to improve the graphical user interface. It wasn't bad before, but now that we're incorporating some more of these advanced techniques, we have some model interface or graphical user interface setups that are a little bit more conducive to running that type of a model. The other area that we wanted to improve on was dealing with the peak periods. So not just having a 1 hour peak period in the evening, but also introducing an AM peak period, midday, improving on the PM peak, and then of course nighttime as well. So the model is made up of 4 time periods, and then we can generate the average daily traffic coming out of the model by aggregating those 4 periods together. So it's a more common approach this way in modern day. The other thing that's sort of an area where this model is kind of unique is this idea of linking the non-home based trips to the home-based trip ends. So non-home-based trips are types of trips that occur from a non-home location. So for example, if you decided that after this meeting, you just want to go get a cup of coffee and you want to make a trip to go do that, that would be a non-home-based type trip. Assuming you're leaving from your work location and coming back, we might classify that as a non-home-based work-related trip. So the idea here with these non-home-based trips is they tend to be kind of floaty. They're just sort of there. We just sort of quantify them, but we really don't understand all that much about them. They're a very weak link in the traditional travel demand modeling process. So what we try to do is link them in some way to at least the quantity of them and where they originate from to the trips that are more easily quantifiable. Those would be the home-based trips. So this is a technique that's been recommended over the years by the Travel Model Improvement Program put out by FHWA. And there are a few models that deal with this, and so we implemented it for this part of this project. Mike, you want to switch the slide? Okay, so the first main topic here is about talking about this population synthesis process. And the reason why we do population synthesis is basically because we have a relatively limited amount of data at the disaggregate level. So what I mean by that is that we can easily get information from the census blocks and the block groups, but that's going to really only allow us to have sort of average values at the zone level. So what the population synthesis allows us to do is to basically create a disaggregate data set, basically a record for each household in the WAMPO area with various characteristics that match that American Community Survey data. So each record in the table that comes out of this is a person in a household. So what does this allow us to do? It gives us a little bit more, it gets back at that resolution of the model, allows us to understand their travel making behavior based on things that we don't typically consider in a travel demand model. So one of the things such as age, whether that person is a worker, all these types of different pieces of information that can be stored at the person or household level. So this is utilizing the PUMS data, which is the public use microsurvey data from the census, along with it's part of the American Community Survey. And we do this process right within our Transcad software. Okay, so this is a significant improvement to the model. Mike, you want to go forward? This is just an example showing you how we're able to match different. This happens to be age, age breakouts and things like that, and the straight line shows a perfect match against the ACS data, and these are the points that come out of the model. So we can do this for employment as well, and that's all good. So let's move to the next slide. This is this population by age and population by work industry. Mike, okay, there we go. The other area where I was talking about earlier was in the trip distribution side, using the destination choice process as opposed to the gravity model, which is a much more simplistic, completely proximity-based type model. This is a little bit more sensitive to key variables such as what we call auto sufficiency, which is considering auto availability in the destination choice process, in the distribution process, congested time, accessibility measures, distance effects, what modes are available, and also obviously what employment opportunities are available or shopping opportunities are available in the zone. So this is a little bit of an alternative approach that it's very common in today's environment, but it's definitely a step forward from the traditional entropy or gravity-based models. Mike, you want to move forward? Okay. So the way we do this destination choice approach is we use a clustering approach because we don't have a lot of individual OD-based data, but we can work within clusters or regions of WAMPO. So what we initially do is use the destination choice model to pick a cluster, one of these colored clusters. And then once we're in that cluster, we know if that trip belongs in that cluster, we can bring it down to the zone level with an additional level of the model, the destination choice model. So this is kind of how we do it. We've done this in many different areas around the country and had great success with it. And we thought it would be great to try it in the WAMPO area, and it seems to have worked well for us. Mike, you want to go ahead? All right, so these are what we call our trip length distributions. Typically, it has this rise and fall. So this is your travel time on the x-axis and your trip frequency on the y-axis. And this is a traditional sort of curve that we expect. Each curve will be different based on the type of trip. So you can see your work-based trips tend to be a little bit elongated in terms of the trip length distribution, whereas your shopping trips and your school trips tend to be a little bit shorter. They peak earlier. The trip lengths are a little bit shorter than typically the home-based work trips. So this is just showing the goodness of fit that came out of the destination choice model. Mike? Okay, getting into the non-home-based trip linking. This is arguably a little bit more of a weedy type, easy to get into the weeds on, but essentially non-home based trips, they're just typically quantified, and we have no relation to knowing who's actually making the trip. So this approach with the trip linking, what it does is it attempts to tie the trip ends coming out of the home-based model to the non-home based. So we know that there are people who did a home-based trip, such as a home-based work trip. So now they're at work and they're going to make additional trips. So you want to be able to sort of quantify them in such a way that we know who made those trips, the people who made the home-based work trips. The same is true for the other home-based purposes. So I was explaining the non-home-based work versus the non-home-based other, work being non-home-based work being trips that originate from a work location, non-home-based other meaning trips that are from a non-work or non-home location. So we tie basically the non-home based work trips to the home-based work trip attractions from the home-based model. And then for the others, for the non-home based other, we anchor those to the home-based other and home-based shopping attractions. So it's a nice approach to make sure that make you feel comfortable that you're in the ballpark with these non-home based trips, and try to do a little bit better job quantifying them and understanding them so that we're dealing with this intermediate stop along the primary tour a little bit better. That's kind of what that's about. Let's move on, Mike. Okay, so the typical approach is still followed for the attraction side. So we have a regression equation that comes up with the attraction side of the non-home-based trips. You see those equations there. That's a very standard approach. It's the production end where the linkage is happening. Okay. Let's go ahead, Mike, on to the next slide. Okay. So this is kind of the step-by-step instruction of how it works. Evaluate the home-based models. Okay. Home-based trip ends. Compute these attractions that I just showed you using those equations before. Use the mode choice to split the market into market segments based on percentages coming from the travel survey that we used. And basically then generate the productions for the non-home based trips using the appropriate trip purposes, the attractions from the home-based purposes. So that's kind of how it works. Balance the productions to the attraction totals by market segment, and then run the destination mode choice and time of day models. So that's kind of a little bit of a summary of how it works. I don't want to go too much into it, but if you have any specific questions, I could certainly go into it in more detail. Mike, why don't we move forward? Okay, so this is, I guess, probably where you want to, the slide where you want to kind of know how we've been doing, how this model is coming along. So when we wrapped this model stream up about 6-7 weeks ago, the model actually came out very, very well. It was basically not in need of too much calibration. When I say that, I mean that we met the federal and state standards pretty much right out of the estimation process, which was pretty remarkable. We weren't really expecting that to happen, but we did very well there. But we've been improving the model steadily over these last 6 weeks. And we're at a point where the model is really performing quite well. So we're quite pleased with that. So our root mean square error is one of the statistics that we use, and we're well below any type of national or state standard there when we look at the overall picture and on particular functional classes of roadway too. So it's safe to say that we have a model right now that is certainly deployable and ready to go. There are a couple corridors that I would like to see a little better performance on, but those can be ironed out as we move forward with the future years. So we talked about these enhanced graphical user interface improvements that we've been doing. So that seems to be working pretty well. Obviously, we have to run the model ourselves at Caliper using the model we created. So we're pretty much the primary user of it right now, and that's good. And so we're happy with the way it's coming out. The traffic assignment is doing well. It's highly convergent. There's not a lot of congestion in the WAMPO area when you look at the overall daily period. Obviously, in the peak period, there's some, but it's that's a good thing. We talked a little bit about this location-based services and connected vehicle data. We use that in the process to kind of verify some of the assumptions we're putting into the model, and also ultimately the results that we obtain from the estimation of the model and looking at the output. The runtime, it's running around, it's actually quite less than 45 minutes right now. It's at around 30 minutes for a 4-period model. It's not too bad, considering it's a fairly, I don't say call it complicated, but it's a complex model, a little bit more horsepower than what was there before. So it's good. The enhanced modeling techniques, the improvements that we did, they seem reasonable and sound, they're not adding too much in the way of complexity and taking away from the usability of the model, nor are they basically, adversely affecting the runtime in any way. We feel pretty good about the models that we estimated, that they make sense, they're sensible, they pass a lot of the tests that you might want to consider, there's looking at different sensitivities and so on. We believe that the new techniques, the improvements do add more accuracy to the model and advance the model forward. As we move forward, we're kind of looking at the developing the future years, and we're doing a little bit more on the model validation side. So calibration means that we are matching the counts, trying to get the output flows from the model to match the count data, the observed data. Validation is more of a test to see that the model responds correctly when you change certain inputs. So for example, if we add 100 households to a zone, how does the model respond to that? If we close a link, close the main corridor in the model, how does it respond to that? So look, the validation is testing the reasonableness of how the model responds to changes in the inputs. So that's kind of what we're working on now, in addition to the future years. And I think there's one more slide, and then we're done, right?
Thank you, Paul. Okay. Yeah, that's basically the end of the presentation. So what's next is basically, as Paul said, we're focused on the future year model now. We've been doing some training with WAMPO staff. We'll continue to do that over the remaining months of the contract, model documentation, of course. And then the rest of the activities are mostly model application support, whether it's the MTP process or working with you all on transportation scenarios and other transportation improvement needs that need to be evaluated. Our team is available and has work scope to do that. So that concludes our presentation. We appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and take any questions.
there any questions for Mike or Paul? Yes, go ahead.
So there's obviously a huge amount of data and concepts and calculations that I can't begin to grasp in that I appreciate that. But there are two things that I think I have some inkling of that I'd like to ask about. First of all, as I understand it, one of the main purposes of the model is to essentially predict where and how much and what kind of traffic there will be on different roads in the future. By comparison, we've done population modeling, increase in population for the region. And to my understanding, those have consistently overestimated the amount of population that would be population growth in the past. What has been the experience with these kinds of models in terms of how accurate or they predicted the traffic compared to how it actually turned out? Is one question. And then the second question is there such a thing as induced demand? And how, if so, how's that taken into account in the models?
Okay. Paul, do you want to address those? I can give a pretty simplistic answer, but you've got a much broader view of the model from your work.
Well, why don't you give your simplistic answer and then I'll add to that. How's that?
Well, on the population question, we're certainly working with the best information we have. We are working again with the WSU to make sure that we're using the best information in terms of population forecasts and other socioeconomic data. In terms of how well does the model work, I guess I could say I've seen it both ways. I mean, I've seen modeling results that are spot on in terms of matching 20-year forecasts, and I've seen model results that are off by a factor of 5. It just depends on a lot of things. Diagonal roads, for example, I've seen some diagonal roads that just because it shortens the path, models tend to put a ton of traffic on there that doesn't really happen in real life. Those are just some examples, and I'm not saying they apply to Wichita, but in general, I've seen it both ways. So Paul, there's my simplistic answer. You want to?
I think that's a good answer. I think from the first part of the question with respect to the population growth and that is sort of not in our hands necessarily, because we're basically presented with those numbers. And as Mike said, he cited the source where they will come from. I will say that is that what you bring up, this optimistic, I guess, optimistic appraisal of population growth is a common theme in a lot of MPOs. And there are basically several ways to get these population numbers. Some people have an integrated land use model that they run, and they generate them that way. Other people sit around their round table with a lot of stakeholders and try to discern where they believe the population growth will go. So that's more of a subjective approach based on building permit allocations and things like that. There's really, unfortunately, no way to tell if the numbers that we're receiving right now are valid or will be valid. There would be really some great value if we could know that, because we could apply that to other parts of our lives too. But yeah, it would be, let's just say that the numbers that were coming up, we believe them to be good, and I think there's a lot of care taken by the folks that are doing it, and so we will apply those numbers and hope that they turn out well. As far as the model forecast values go, it's kind of tied to those inputs. So you've probably heard about the term garbage in, garbage out. No matter how sophisticated the model is, if you put lousy forecasts into it, the answer is going to be lousy coming out. So it's, I guess, much dependent on that. The way the MPO cycle typically works with these models is that there isn't often a lot of backcasting that is done. And that's kind of unfortunate because there's a lot of money that are spent on these models. So it would be good to do kind of like a summary or autopsy on how well the model did over time. But typically the update cycles dictate an update of the model every so many years. And oftentimes when those model updates are done, the previous forecasts are no longer used. They are rebuilt in the model update. But it's a very excellent question, and it sort of gets at the heart of, why are we doing this, and like, well, how do we know that what we're getting out is reasonable for decision making? So I think the question is excellent. I wish I had a better answer for you. I can tell you that we'll do our best to make sure that from a validation point of view, the future year scenarios look good, and I'm sure WAMPO staff is committed to that as well. And we'll review the outputs that we generate with this model. The key thing to understand, I guess, with future year models or future year demographics is that, in terms of the model output, is that the model is built on the base year assumption. Base year assumptions, so things like what are those trip lengths, what are the mode shares at this time. The models are sort of designed to replicate those numbers. So the assumptions stay the same. It's just that some of the inputs change. So the actual modeling assumptions are identical in the future year. It's just that the demographics change. So yeah, so I guess hopefully that answers your question to some degree, or gives you a little bit better understanding of how it works.
Thanks, Bob.
Is there any further questions from the TAC committee?
Is there such a thing as induced demand, and
yes, we skipped that one. Yeah. Yes, there is. So basically induced demand occurs when when either new capacity opens, and then it tends to shift trips that would have been made by, say, a transit mode or by perhaps walking or biking. And obviously that capacity fills quicker than any forecast would ever lead you to believe, right? So there is induced demand. The model captures it to some degree, but the number of trips in the model is generally fixed based on the household data. So and the trip rates that we use that were estimated during the estimation process. So induced demand sometimes implies that the number of trips will increase based on improvements to the network. That element is not captured as well by the travel demand model, but certainly the dynamic of filling unused capacity is, or improved transit if you take it in a different direction. Induced demand, just the nature of increasing the number of trips because the quality of service is better. That's not exactly well handled by this, just because the estimations of the model are done at the time, during the process with the available data at that time. So, but you can observe the dynamic of how the flow shifts when you do change the network, of course.
And Paul and Mike, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you for the time. We appreciate it.
Oh, sure. Moving right along, we have the next item is the Regional Transit Implementation Plan. Bill?
Good morning. Just from a logistics standpoint, okay. I'll if we want to just go on to the next slide, and I'll just tell you when to advance. Okay, that understanding that this is our first presentation, first discussion with everybody at the TAC, we wanted to make sure that we covered some of the background information associated with the study that we're completing, the elements that I want to touch on, and I'll try to be brief on each that's shown here. So let's just go on to the next slide and to the next one. Just to kind of cover who you'll be really seeing, those folks that will have an active role, and particularly those that will be in Wichita over the course of the remaining, we're at probably about 10 or 11 months of completing the work. include 2 staff members from Nelson Nygaard, Sam Wright and James Gamez, that you may have been introduced to them a little bit in the Connecting Communities project. And then also Aaron Wynn with Shockey, that Shockey will be doing a lot of our in-person outreach and elements like that. And Avon Moore, who is a transportation planner with me here in Omaha, that she will also have a very key role in the work. Next slide. So let's just talk a little bit about our project understanding, because I think I want to make sure at the beginning here that we're all on the same page as kind of that environment that we're working in. So let's go to the next slide. So when you think about our focus area, which I suppose it's kind of goofy to call it a focus area when we're looking at the entire MPO area, but within the area that there are, I think quite a broad array, or there is quite a broad array of those communities that we're going to be working in. That when you think about all of the range of population distribution that we have amongst all of the communities, you look at the opportunities that communities have for that whole packet of goods and services that each of us needs to access every day. There's a lot of communities that we're going to be working with is that, well, we have housing. We don't really have much for shopping. We really don't have anything for local medical services, things like that. Those elements that, and those uses that are very connected to transit use. And we want to make sure that we have that good understanding at the beginning, which is a market assessment that we're in the process of doing now. In that understanding, again, I think leading out of the travel demand modeling element and into this, that some of those same ideas of movement back and forth between communities that are going to come out of the modeling process are also applicable with what we'll be looking at here. Next slide, please. That also in our discovery phase that we're pretty much wrapping up at this point in time, is that we want to, and we're understanding and looking at changes in population, changes in employment that have occurred between the 2010 census and the 2020 census, and understanding that a lot of the growth that's occurred within the WAMPO area has occurred in those exurban areas. So those areas outside of Wichita and in many of those communities. That and that there is a little bit, when we look at it from, well, who has transit service within the area, that I would put it as at a level of there is some service within the county, that there's service through Sedgwick County Transit, but there is a relatively limited amount of what I'll call is that in-town service. So in those small communities, the ability to go and if there is shopping there, to go from my home to shopping in those communities that, maybe the distance is a little bit further than you could walk, things like that. But that is relatively limited within the focus area that we're looking at. We also are bringing into this, and I think that that's key of how we put our team together, is understanding all of these elements that have been going on with the Connecting Communities work that was done a few years ago, the Wichita Transit redesign that's going on now, the coordinated plan that was put together in 2018 for the coordinated transportation district, and then the update of the WAMPO area coordinated plan. That I think the key element of our team is that between us and Nelson Nygaard, that we are, you've got the group that did the coordinated, the Connecting Communities work with Nelson Nygaard and Shockey. The redesign is work again between all three of our firms. SRF was responsible for the CTD update, again, back in 2018. So we bring, I think, a good understanding of the history of things that have been looked at and ideas, but at the same time, new ideas of things to look forward to into the future. Next slide, please. And as we look at and develop those concepts, and again, I think the conversation that was just being had relative to land use and population changes going forward, that those characteristics of employment, of population, that we will also be looking at those, but our focus is going to be a little bit more on today. But then with the understanding that as we look around and identify potential for need of additional transit service, there may be a lot of situations. And I think this was one of the things that came out of the Connecting Communities study, is that there were some communities that weren't quite ready yet. And I think, and I've emphasized it here with the bold, is that, with transit service, particularly in rural areas, or those areas that are going to be outside of Wichita, that there has to be interest in the community to make the investment. Because when you look at how transit service in an area is funded, there's the federal funding element, there's the state funding element, there's fares that are collected, and then there still needs to be a local match. So I think that one of the biggest challenges that we're gonna come into is making sure that there is support for that local match. And how do we go about doing that? Is making sure that things are right-sized, in that you're providing service that is appropriate for a community, so that you can demonstrate that there is a return on that investment that is positive. As we're looking at concepts, that there are a number of elements that we need to be thinking about. Is what are the areas that we want to focus on serving? Is it within the communities that are out there? Is there that intra-community flow, or is it more from the outlying communities to those activity centers in Wichita, or those activity centers where there is employment that is expanding these days outside of Wichita? Is there demand, and enough demand between those areas to support service? But then there's that what type of service, and I'll touch on that in a little bit here. And then when do we want to be providing, or when can we support service? And finally, coming down to cost. We want to make sure that as we're looking at the alternatives, that we're focusing on who those providers will be within a particular area, and that those providers could be an individual community, it could be the county, but it also could be kind of that conglomeration of various communities, because that's one of the key things that we're going to be focusing on in this study, is not just, well, where is service and where is demand supported, but it's how do we put together the organizational structure if we want to advance more transit service within the area. How does that organization look? Because in this map, having the map up here is pretty important, in that each of the kind of stars there are potential areas and potential locations that would have service. And the thing we want to be making sure that we focus on are each of these independently operating agencies, or is there a level of coordination between them? So let's go to the next slide. And then finally, as we get down to that last step that we're going to be looking at, is making sure that the reality that we're moving forward to is logical. Does the service that we're talking about support the goals that communities have? Again, because each of the communities that want some level of additional service, they are going to have skin in the game. We want to make sure that we're looking at the capital costs, the operating costs, because a lot of times it's relatively easier, I'll say, is to get support for a capital cost, because that's generally a one-time request for funding, or a once every 5 years, every 6 years. But the operating cost request is where we generally see the need to make sure that we have that local support. I've already talked a little bit about the management, or the organizational format, that is going to be key for the work that we're doing. And I think one of the other things on our understanding is that not every one of the communities is in the same place today. There are some communities that have transit service. There are other communities that don't have any transit service, and they really don't see it as a key need within their community, or at least one that rises to the level of being able to find additional local resources to make it come to fruition. So I think that that is one of those very realistic things that we bring into this is understanding that not everybody is in the same place and not everybody has to be in the same place. So let's go on to the next slide. I'm just going to touch on the approach real quick here. We essentially break it into 4 steps, and that where we're at today is that we're wrapping up that first step of the understanding. We've already started thinking about and kind of noodling out some potential scenarios based on what we already understand about the area. We'll be evaluating a broad range of scenarios that I'll touch on here in a couple seconds, using a consistent set of criteria that reflect transit use, that reflect the benefit that you get, that reflects the cost, those elements, and ultimately coming up with a set of recommendations. That throughout we'll be holding stakeholder engagement. One of the things that I want to make sure we point out is that we have been working with folks at WAMPO to coordinate the work that we're doing relative to outreach with the work that is presently going on with the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, which you think about it, that's a multimodal plan for the entire MPO area. It just makes sense that as we're doing this transit element, that we coordinate with them or with that project. Next slide. And let's just go to the next one. Let's just skip over here. I mean, the list of deliverables, everybody can kind of look at that. The thing I want to make sure that whoops, that didn't really translate very well. The thing that I want to point out is that we want to make sure we're looking at a very broad range of ideas for the type of service that could be provided. You think about those areas that are contiguous with Wichita. There may be some opportunities for extending fixed route service into those areas. Whereas I think the initial thought process that most probably would consider is that demand response type service. So dial a ride type services are probably the most applicable throughout the area. While we'll be looking at that as a primary concept, we want to make sure we're also being a little bit innovative, a little bit, hey, let's not just stay in that realm of a service that you have to arrange for at least the day before, and I have to arrange by calling or sending an email or something like that. That we want to make sure that we're looking at some more of those innovative elements, which may be incorporating, the Uber, Lyft, those TNC or ride hailing services, which Park City is already doing to a certain extent, and other elements of microtransit, which theoretically, it's a lot like demand response, but the turnaround between a reservation and making the trip is much, much quicker. And then in the middle there with the concept of van pools is, I know one of the things that we've already started talking about is those large employers that are on the periphery, that are outside the service area for Wichita Transit, or provide shift changes outside the time frame that Wichita Transit is operating, so that maybe I can use transit to get to work, but it's not operating when I need to go home. We want to be considering those opportunities for van pool, because those around the clock operations, particularly on the fringe, are very appropriate and conducive to talking about the concept of van pools. And a lot of the organizations or those firms like Amazon, they already have these kind of services in other areas of the country, so that they're completely familiar with how they operate. Next slide. And as I kind of pointed out earlier, is that looking at the opportunities for organizing service and essentially managing service within the area, is going to be a key element of what we're looking at. And they could be from one end of the spectrum of looking at a number of independent agencies. So each community could be an operator, the county could be a bigger operator maybe than it is today, or we could go to the entire other end of the spectrum and look at one umbrella agency or an authority that would operate transit service within the entire and manage transit service within the entire MPO area that could incorporate both fixed route kinds of service and demand response kinds of service. And that one of the keys that we have to figure out is where along that continuum works best for the region or works best for different sub areas of the region, so that this will be a key element of what we'll be looking at after we come down and start to figure out some of those services that could be out there. Next slide. And as we're looking at the type of agency, it comes down to, well, where is service needed? Where is service able to be supported? And the interaction and the interrelationship between various potential providers within the region. And what does each of the providers want to provide for a service area, service hours, the type of service that they're providing, and all of those elements. Next slide. And that we could be looking at an organizational structure that is independent operators within an entire area, but maybe one overall administrative structure. But we could also be looking at the idea of, as I said before, an authority. Let's go to the next slide. And that authority has a series of members, and that it manages service throughout that area. But we want to make sure that even as we're considering and thinking about an authority, that not every location within the metropolitan area that would desire service needs to be a part of the authority. Authority in a transit authority concept doesn't work for everybody. But then maybe that those areas could still be customers. They could buy some level of service from the authority. And the intent here is just to make sure that folks understand the breadth of the work that we're going to be covering here as we continue over the next several months. Okay, next slide. That should be about it, I think. Let's just kind of scooch on. We can touch on these things a little bit later. And just real briefly, to cover our project schedule, is that we are wrapping up that element of background. And each of the elements here is that we're just wrapping up now the market assessment that will be, I did some editing of that element over the weekend, and we'll be getting that out to WAMPO for their review this week. That we will have public meetings throughout each of the key phases, and exactly how they end up looking, because when you think about the diversity of the area, the geographic coverage of the area, we need to be a little bit innovative in how we make sure that people have the ability to conveniently participate. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, let's just wrap this up. Again, as I said, is that we are in the process of completing the market assessment to understand where are those areas within the metropolitan area that have characteristics that are conducive or supportive or consistent with transit service. So where are seniors? Where are people with single or no car households? Where are we looking at various wages and levels of income? All of those kind of characteristics that support transit service, and that is the work that we've completed, at least to a draft stage. And I think we want to make sure that we're also pointing out is that ongoing with the WAMPO project is a similar project with Sedgwick County. There, one of the key differences is the focus there is also on technology, understanding that that could also be a situation where multiple providers come together and you want to support the opportunity for coordination, technology can be a very key element of supporting that coordination. And then ultimately also with the Wichita Transit redesign, the idea that, that the bulk of the trips that you're going to be seeing, and everybody already knows this, is that the trips that are needed for medical trips, for some of those shopping trips, or even employment trips, that Wichita and the areas immediately adjacent to Wichita are the big draw. So we want to make sure that we're coordinating the more regional work also with the redesign and understanding, is there potential for opportunities at the fringe to create interaction locations and transfer locations at the fringe, so that the more rural areas of the MPO area can interact and be brought into the Wichita Transit Service area. I think that's it. If we could go next slide just to make sure. Yes, that was it. So with that, I'll answer any questions that you may have.
Anybody have any questions for Bill? Appreciate your presentation.
Okay, thank you.
All right, moving along. Next, we have the committee and partnership updates. Are there any updates? And other business? Any other business that anybody needs to talk about? If not, I thank everybody for sticking around today. I know it was a very long meeting. We have adjournment. So I'll see you next month.